Alright, since this is the official start of the whole horror-themed month, somebody suggested that I do something to make it a bit more festive of sorts, and this is pretty much the best you're gonna get. So, you're not here to really see my face anyway, so it doesn't matter too much. I call this the start. I guess it technically is. The technical start was when we did Interview with the Vampire and Queen of the Damned, but that was actually intended to always be the week before, so this was kind of always going to be the start of it. So, yeah, regardless, here we are. So, and we got a whole month of this, so let's go ahead and get started. I think it's pretty clear what these two have in common. With these, they're both based on TV series, with obviously the Addams Family also being the comic series, but then there's also the her comic strip, whatever the hell it was. I'm actually not quite completely sure, but I do remember seeing particular like animation throughout time of these characters, and I think they're doing like another one right now with like Oscar Isaac playing or voicing Gomez or something like that. But in the meantime, we have these two, and obviously it's the whole sort of eccentric families within this sort of macabre setting. And both are more or less played for comedy, more so than horror, but yeah, so why not start with that anyway? I think we're going to start with the Addams Family. So, going on that, I believe it was the first time Barry Sonnenfeld actually directed a movie. Obviously, he was mostly known as a cinematographer, particularly for, like, Raising Arizona, among many other things. He may have worked with Coen Brothers more than once, but I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But regardless, you will notice immediately that it sort of comes off like there might be a bit of Burton influence. But not just that, but there's also, because when you look at the whole time frame, when you've got like whenever the comics were, and then there's also the TV series, which I think was like from 64 to 66, which was black and white, which actually kind of suits the material a little bit, I think. I've only seen, like, there was one night where I, like, couldn't sleep because there was a really bad storm, and of course, while it's storming is when I just happen to have it on one of those TV channels that just plays, like, old reruns, and they were playing the Addams Family, like, all night. It just so happened, and I don't even really remember much of what I saw. But that's pretty much my only grasp on what the show was. I think one of the episodes might have been the one that they sort of picked up and put into the movie as just one moment when it's when they go to the auction and they donate their own stuff and then bid on their own shit, which is hilarious. But obviously now that it's gotten to this point in 1991. It's going to be very 90s, and was also sort of, when you talk about the Burton influence, or so it seems, this was like right in that area. This was like 3 years post Beetlejuice, and you can kind of tell. Like, I'd be really surprised if Sonnenfeld said he didn't have any particular Burton influence going into this, whether it be the production design or the score, because, I mean, obviously being 1991, it somehow, of all people, ended up with an MC Hammer-themed score, or not, soundtrack, excuse me. The score is Mark Shaman, who I honestly wouldn't doubt that many people confuse this for a Danny Elfman score. I'm sure I did a time or two before I really looked at the credits, but yeah, so that's pretty much the era that this is set in. The question is what kind of movie are you going to get when you put all those things together? Well, one of the interesting things that they go into is, or they kind of explore, is this idea that the Addamses just, I mean, I'm sure this is like the whole concept, but particularly in the movie, the whole idea of them just kind of coexisting with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world just kind of has to deal with it. Nobody really brings up the fact of, I'm pretty sure they have living dead family members. They themselves may be living dead. It becomes a very blurry sort of thing here, and I don't know if it's ever... I did some research, and I didn't really find anything that said for sure exactly if they're dead or alive, or who, or what exactly is what, or where they come from, or anything like that. They just exist. So if there is backstory on that, the movie doesn't get into it, and that's what we're talking about, so yeah. But the whole, like, the scenes like the school play, for instance, and how we get to see just how much they stick out in public when they're like sitting in the middle of the auditorium, which I doubt is an accident on the framing part of this, but and the way they just sort of react to everything else. How there should be something that just really sticks out in this odd way in regards to how they react to certain things, and they're just bored by what regular people do, more or less. And there's always going to be those moments that kind of, and they mainly come from Morticia interacting with people, because obviously Gomez does it from more of a seemingly like a distance than Morticia does. So we have all these conversations, and it does become a joke that you kind of get to know the mechanics of pretty quickly, where Morticia will be talking to somebody, and then you'll think it's going in one direction, and she'll just kind of pull it in like another more morbid one. For instance, when she's talking about how Gomez hasn't been the same since Fester left, and she's going through all the normal symptoms, and then she says he's coughing up blood, and then sadly says not like he used to. It's like that sort of formula to her lines is consistent throughout the whole movie. But Anjelica Huston's perfect delivery obviously keeps it from getting stale. Because that's something that a lot of people tend to bring up when they talk about the high points of this movie. The completely and totally spot-on casting is usually the very first thing mentioned. Because obviously you've got Anjelica Huston pretty much perfecting this role. Like I said, with all these different deliveries, I love the when she's going through Uncle Nick Nack's summer wardrobe, and then winter wardrobe, and then the third bag is him. Just her delivery of that joke just completely sells it in a way. Because that's kind of what she does, is she just kind of flows into the punchlines. And sometimes you may not even catch them right away because they're just so smoothly in there. And she gets quite a few at the school, whether it be the when they're talking about their heroes, the children's heroes in the pictures, and she's like, you know, have you told their parents? And once they won't be able to act like her great aunt, who was a witch that was like burned at the stake until she's older. All the stuff like that. But then on the other side, you have Raul Julia doing Gomez, and the interesting thing about this is that if you look at Julia's filmography, you'll see that he was obviously like a master of drama, if you see movies like Kiss of the Spider-Woman. But the thing about it was he was in a lot of comedy, too. The movie that I always recommend when he gets brought up is Moon Over Parador with Richard Dreyfuss, which he's just brilliant in. But the thing that he does, that he also brings to this, honestly brings most notably to this, and this kind of goes into another one of his more famous roles, which was Street Fighter. And that was his ability to take pretty much any type of material and make it like it was deliver it like it was Shakespeare, practically. And that's just as apparent here as it ever was in many respects. And when you get from this performance, especially with the way he interacts with people, is where a lot of the next point comes from, which is this movie's kind of approach to its material, because you sort of think, I mean, obviously it's PG-13, and that's a 1991 PG-13. In 1991, it kind of felt like you could get away with more, but the thing is that obviously it does have a really dark and twisted sense of humor. There's all the sexual innuendo between Gomez and Morticia and all that. But the thing about it is that it still feels like basically a family-oriented movie, just because of how the energy is shown. Like, it has the feel that it was made to entertain both adults and children, by how really quick and flashy a lot of the scenes are. There's like a couple of dance scene breaks. Whenever things get like really hectic, there's very heavy editing, and the music gets a bit more light. And the way it's able to balance that with where the humor's coming from, and how it's this very morbid concept in general, is a really interesting balance, and like the real strength of the movie, that it's able to find that and make a movie that just feels so light in tone, despite all the really dark shit that it's making jokes about. Because you also have our supporting cast, like Wednesday and Pugsley. Obviously, Christina Ricci, this is a role that will probably follow her forever, and I don't think she probably minds that much. But just how, when you think of the casting, like, when you look at Morticia and Gomez, that's your first thought, but then there's also the idea that pretty much nobody else but Christina Ricci you can imagine doing this, especially after having seen her done it. Because she just really kind of had that dark way about her, and the expressions on her face, how they can be really blank, but she can also put like this mischievous evil in her eyes too, even when she looks almost completely expressionless. But then there's also the interesting casting choice, because you look at them and you think they pretty much look like who they're supposed to be playing. I think Gomez is supposed to be a bit more like on the portly side, but the suaveness just really comes through with Joy's appearance anyway. But when you think about what Fester's supposed to look like, Christopher Lloyd probably wouldn't have been your go-to, especially in this particular era, where you have to have somebody that you would have to put in a fat suit and do the whole, make them bald and make them look just like this kind of bulging weirdo, and it's like, you get a sense of that Christopher Lloyd could easily do that kind of character, but the look of it, if you hadn't seen it prior and you were just going in the pre-production stage, it might be kind of a hard thing to imagine, but then the way they pull it off, it's almost like, first off, he blends in perfectly. Because you see Christopher Lloyd in so many movies growing up, whether it be Back to the Future or Roger Rabbit or Dennis the Menace or whatever, Camp Nowhere even, and you just don't really associate these characters at all. Like, he's kind of really, I mean, obviously he's this name that everybody knows, but he's still kind of on the underrated side when you think about the fact that most of us grew up with this dude in all these different parts, yet it takes forever to really sink in that this is the same dude when you're a kid watching movies. And this role in particular really makes that stand out. This was probably I probably figured out that all those other roles were him before I figured out that this was. And you'd even think his voice would be a dead giveaway, but no. At least for me, anyway. And that's how I remember it, anyway. This would have been 20 years ago or more, but still. So I really like how much of that panned out. But then we also have... the problem here is Lurch also, who the guy you might recognize later also worked with Sonnenfeld on Men in Black. He was the big dude with the little dude in his head, and obviously, much like Wednesday, a lot of this is what he can do with a totally blank expression and how much he can make that work. Whether it be when he's what are some? I just completely blanked now. There's the one shot where something is disrupting everything and the house shakes, and there's this shot of him just sort of sitting in his pajamas, which is a funny image in itself, and just kind of taking it in like it's a normal thing, and it's just that little shot for some reason I've always loved of him. But then there's also the stuff when they have the lemonade stand towards the end, or the lemonade stand that's poison and arsenic or whatever the hell else it is. And obviously they throw in those little details too, where it's behind him is the Tombstone Pizza billboard, and it says what do you want on your tombstone, as Lurch is drinking actual poison. So little details like that always work, even if they're not completely subtle. Just the fact that they're there is great. So so you might notice when you talk about this, if there's one problem the movie may have, and you may not see this as a problem depending on where you're coming from, but the fact that the movie basically feels instead of a cohesive thing, just more various bits, more or less, just little standalone scenes, whether it be Pugsley with the stop sign, which I think is another thing that came from the comics, where it's just those comics that were basically just one little bit and then that was it. And you get a sense of that throughout it, which, if that was the intention, at least a little bit, it does pay off quite well. But the thing here, though, is that they are trying to do a plot also. A plot that I've never been all that crazy about. The whole Fester is apparently an imposter named Gordon that's been hired by his mother to pose as him so they can get the fortune. But then there's also the idea of, is it the real Fester? And weirdly, the movie fails to acknowledge either way until the last 2 minutes, when they just brush it on the rug and say, oh, he had amnesia, it is really him. And I think I read somewhere that it was actually their intention to not even bother to even confirm if it was actually him, whether or if it was just he was just kind of accepted with them. And I guess the cast even was like uneasy about that, so they if what I read is correct, they let Christina Ricci try to convince Scott Rudin to let the excuse me. That almost killed me, because if you've ever heard any stories about Scott Rudin, you would know that he doesn't really seem like a guy that you'd want to negotiate with, let alone sending a child, and maybe they thought that would have been their best bet. But at some point, apparently, she did convince him that they needed, like, to know for sure if he was actually Fester, or if they were just kind of letting in this stranger as Fester, or whatever the hell they'd been planning. It seemed like it really wasn't well thought out, this plot, and how it connected to whether it was actually him or not. And to maybe put a distance on it, there is something here that's sort of like, it's sort of combating, because there's the idea that, to my understanding, up until this movie, Fester was supposed to be, like, related to Morticia. He was supposed to be, like, Morticia's uncle or something, which would mean that he wasn't actually, like, an Addams. But then to, like, really bring that forward and make Fester Gomez's brother, to make him that close to the family, is a really interesting choice. But then, once again, it's like, that seems like if you're going to go that close and make him that closely related, this is kind of an odd plot to go with. But, yeah, and then, like I said, the way they just sort of speedily, you know, bring it back at the very end, and it's like, it's just a bit odd. But maybe it also goes to show that the plot isn't really all that important, and maybe it's more so just the episodic bits is what we really came here for, and will give the movie, like, its real energy and stuff like that. Because that is something, it is a comedy, and there are hilarious moments in it. But for the most part, it does seem like the movie is more focused on, like, having a big energy as opposed to having big laughs. Because a lot of the laughs just sort of come from you, like, sort of, like, huh, that's clever, or whatever. So, like, every now and then they go big, like, with the school play and how that turns out and all that. But for the most part, the laughs seem like they're really going for downplayed. And it's more just about just keeping it moving, like, a lot. And sometimes they do, like, have those certain techniques that Sonnenfeld really captured as a cinematographer before he even became a director, where we've got, like the point-of-view shot of Thing going to answer the door, or the really frenetic editing when he's, Gomez is playing with the train set, and stuff like that. And yes, that is Barry Sonnenfeld himself going by as the passenger in the train just before it blows up, colliding with the other one. Which is funny. But, yeah, so that's something that kind of stands out to me when I watch it these days, how kind of devoid of, like, the really big moments that it is. It sort of just kind of goes along its way for a while, which I do find interesting, but still, that doesn't necessarily take down the entertainment value, but, yeah, it did seem a bit more, like, grand and lively as a child than it really does now. Not to say that production design isn't, like, insanely good, and the costumes were even nominated for an Oscar, but, yeah, and eventually, talking about this plot also, it does mean that we're eventually going to reach some low point where they find out that Fester is an imposter. At least he can be accepted as one for now. But it's, like, really late in the movie when the movie reaches that low point where it's supposed to be, like, the conflict where everything dies down and then a solution's coming. But it makes the movie kind of feel long because the low point comes so late. When it probably feels like it should be about wrapping up, we do the whole thing where they have to move out and they go to a motel and all that other stuff. Like, they do have some bits in there, like the lemonade bit, or, when Gomez is, like, really appalled that they might go out and miss Gilligan's Island. That's really funny. That's another one of those Shakespearean deliveries from Julia with such a small thing. But yeah, so it's... But overall, though, that energy I was talking about just really does go a long way. And it is... Because some people think it might go a bit lower, because it seems to go back and forth. Because obviously a lot of people love the sequel as well. And the thing about this is it seems like I hear, like, back and forth, like, it fluctuates every time. Like, there'll be a long period where I hear people say that they think the sequel is the better one. But then every now and then a period comes along where it seems like I consistently hear that people think this one is far superior. which I think I probably prefer the sequel just a little bit because it's got a bit more. It does have that energy, but it also goes for the laughs, and the plot, while, completely, wrung out, still is great because you add the energy you already have, and then you add Joan Cusack playing a complete and total psychopath to that, and it adds a whole other level to this campiness that the movie feels like it desperately needs. And you got the great subplot with the summer camp with Peter McNichol and Christine Baranski, which is worth watching the sequel alone. And of course, it's Christina Ricci getting even more. She gets more screen time. She gets more to do, and she gets to really play with this character in much more memorable ways. The whole beginning of it is like a mainstream comedy about two kids trying to kill a baby. I mean, where else are you gonna see that? So yeah, but overall, it is really fun. They did also do the made-for-TV movie where Tim Curry played Gomez, and I can't remember what else. Addams Family Reunion, I think it was. I saw like a little bits and pieces of it, but I saw enough to say like I don't really need to finish this. So it's not quite up to this. The sequel also, it's worth noting, also got an Oscar nomination for its production design. So so all of that from the techno aspect and all that other stuff does bring this together nicely. Then you also look at, like I said, something similar, Dark Shadows. This is the 2012 entry of the Depp-Burton collaborations. So, obviously, when we start off, we're in, like, the 17 or 1800s, or something, 1700s, I believe. And we get the whole backstory, which really sets up, like, this really sort of serious gothic story. This honestly seems like something that would have been somewhat more interesting than what they decided to go with, depending on how they did it, of course. Ultimately ends with Eva Green being rebuffed by Depp in favor of Bella Heathcote, so she curses him to be a vampire, and he's asleep for almost 2 years after she's also killed Bella Heathcote at this point. And she's going to live on and take over whatever while he just happens to be rising from the grave as the 70s come in. I think it's like 72 or something. So of course the first thing on everybody's mind is, well, we've got to have a 70s soundtrack. Of course we do. And not to say that I'm saying that's a bad idea. We do have this really shockingly atmospheric opening title sequence set to Nights on White Satin. That's just this really sort of talking about Nights on White Satin, I hate to use this word, I wish I had another one, moody. This nice little moody opening of Bella Heathcote, who is apparently Joseph from the past, reincarnated supposedly, who is pretty vague about that, but anyway, I mean, I guess it's not too vague because you cast the same actress, but I mean, as far as the story goes and the way Barnabas reacts to her, it seems a little too vague, and a little too last minute when they bring it into play, but yeah, we do have this nice moody opening, and it sort of sucks to say shockingly atmospheric, because obviously Burton was like the master of this stuff in the 80s and early 90s. But yeah, there is a little bit of the classic Burton coming through in this a little bit, but obviously this also came along in a time where people were getting like super sick of the Depp-Burton collaboration, and it seemed to be getting lazier and lazier. I think this was the very next one after Alice in Wonderland, so that shows you where we were. And of course, shock surprise, Helena Bonham Carter's in it too. Even if it's a small part, she's still there. But the thing you'll notice as you're watching this opening title sequence, or looking at the case or whatever, they got a pretty stellar cast for this. A nice big one with these really spectacular actors that, like Michelle Pfeiffer, for instance, where you think, oh my god, Michelle Pfeiffer reteaming with Burton. And it's like, when they collaborated before, they made a character that was like absolutely iconic, that people like still dress up as like every year. And then we've got her in this, and even though she's like sort of the head of everything and all that, she still feels incredibly underused, and like she really doesn't get to do a whole lot, except kind of stand around the mansion and like basically tell Depp what's going on. And that's honestly all it feels like, which is a huge disappointment. And you'll sort of see this throughout. There are characters that get to stand out, though, like Jackie Earle Haley, who I love so much in this. Just that very first scene of him, like the very first time we see him, when he opens the door and Bella Heathcote introduces herself, and his response is just congratulations. And it's like, even though he's expecting her, he apologizes for not picking her up at the station. It's like he still doesn't even know what he's supposed to do at this point. And then he's just got that sort of bitter way about him when they go in and we see this, you know, great set, this production design that we expect from a Burton movie, just really grand and really, like, that gothic look and all that. And, like, this big chandelier. And she's like, oh my god, it's so beautiful. And Haley just basically says under his breath, but it's a bitch to dust. And that's just how tired of this place's shit that he is. And he keeps that up throughout the whole movie. And pretty much any time he's gone, you kind of hope he'll somehow find his way back in just to comment on something. Which we don't have enough of. So every now and then we'll just get him like singing in his car. But we really could have used more of him. But something that will probably draw a lot of attention is the presence of Eva Green as our villainess, who is a witch, the one that made Barnabas a vampire. And the thing about that is that she does get to do, like, the really, really sort of over-the-top thing, pretty much exactly what you would expect her to do in this role in this movie. And I believe a lot of people considered her the high point at the time, which I can totally see. I'm not as into her as other people are, but as far as, like, pretty much with Casino Royale and forward, it's like I just always sort of saw her as, like, this sort of a bit of an overrated entity, but even so, I do like the idea of what she's doing here, and for the most part, I do like how she does it. But which I blame totally on Burton, she'll eventually lose her way. Particularly when we get closer to the climax. But in the meantime, we've also got Chloe Moretz doing the whole sort of, you know, outcast thing, the teenage daughter that's sick of everybody's shit. It's always putting on music and dancing so she doesn't have to listen to anybody else, who may or may not have a secret of her own that she's hiding. But the thing, and she's got that, to sort of show off that outcast quality, they do that kind of nice setup at the beginning when everybody's at the, like, dining table and they're all kind of on one side of it, and then there's just this entirely other empty side that she's at the foot of. So I always like that sort of placement to show that even if it's blatant, it still looks nice on camera. So but the thing here is that when you look at its appearance, and it does, like, have a nice mood when it first sets it up. But the thing is as it goes on, it does look like, it does have this bit of a dreary look to it after a while. Like, it's gonna wear off a little bit. And I think that might have to do with the fact that, that I pretty much now associate the look of the movie with just the movie itself, if that makes sense. Where, like, because, like, the movie's trying to do a bunch of different genres. Because, like, if you want to see it as a comedy, it's like, it looks, as appearance-wise, aesthetic-wise, it looks way too dreary to be a comedy. As a horror movie, it's not quite dreary enough. As, like, this sort of, because the show was like a soap opera, it's like, so if you want to go for, like, this sort of melodrama thing, then it just kind of has this sort of boring aesthetic to it, which, I mean, if you're going to try to go for the soap opera vibe as, like, an homage, then you might have something there, but I don't think that's the movie's intention, because there's too much of the attempts at comedy and horror in it to really go for that, or believe that that's the case. But every now and then, that's not to say that it doesn't have something that's, you know, effectively horror-like or something comedic. One effective horror scene that actually, I remember, like, really chilling me when I saw it in theaters, was the moment when we see, when the kid, I think David is his name, first introduces himself. He does it with the sheet over his head with the holes. And then later on, somebody else is doing that. And when she pulls off the sheet, she sees that it is, that's a ghost. And it's like the way we can already see her eyes through the holes, and then when she lifts it up, you kind of expect, well, if it's a ghost, then nothing will be there. But the fact that she is there, that's a pretty creepy, well-done scene, the way that's sort of revealed and kind of goes against that expectation of what you expect to see under the sheet. So I really like the way that was done, but then those moments are, like, so few and far between. Because we also have something that's also a bit surprising, especially since we know they're going for kind of a comedic tone, especially where Depp is concerned. His return, when, like, he actually kills people at the beginning. Like, yeah, sure, he apologizes for it, but it's still, like, really vicious. Like, he's just... There's no stopping him. He's just too thirsty. But then the way he, like, throws the dude's body into the box, there's just something really brutal about it. And, of course, they'll immediately follow this up with comedic stuff, like the McDonald's joke, which is probably one of the more actually funny uses of product placement we've seen for a while. Because it's a nice brief joke that they did set up in the prologue. But the thing here also is that they do find ways to, like, not really go for it. Like, there's some small things in here, like, when he's basically laying out his whole story, and he's, like, sort of, like, setting up his depression, but at the same time, he's, like, inadvertently playing this synthesizer to, like, score his own story, which is really funny. But then you have stuff where you can just tell they sort of dropped the ball. Like, the whole lava lamp thing really felt like it was supposed to be going somewhere, where he's, like, looking into Chloe Moretz's room, and he sees the lava lamp, and of course we know he sees it as blood, but then it just cuts to another scene. There's, like, no... It's like it seemed like a setup, but then there was no payoff for it. It's just, hey, lava lamps kind of look like blood. The end. We just wanted to acknowledge that. It's like, no, you don't even get a scene of him trying to drink the lava lamp. It would have been predictable, but the scene would have had some sort of payoff. But they didn't go for it. The scene just kind of stops. It's almost like there's a deleted scene somewhere where that scene has some sort of other side to it, but we never see that. And then there's the Alice Cooper cameo, where we get to see Alice Cooper put on yet another concert, where we get sort of Wayne's World vibes. And that's the thing, is when you think about Wayne's World, you remember how funny they made the Alice Cooper cameo. But the thing was that it was after the concert and him interacting with the other characters. And the weird thing about that is that you totally expect that. Because with the way Barnabas is, and the way he's from another part of history, and he, like, keeps mistaking him for a woman, you would think there would be some big funny payoff scene where these two get to interact. But no, once the concert's over, we just never see Alice Cooper again. And it's like, I really thought that was going somewhere. I thought that would have been the whole point. But no, it was really just to say Alice Cooper was here. And then he wasn't. That's it. So, you can tell where they really just dropped the ball there. And that's the thing, is and then once you get past this stuff, the movie is just inevitably reaching a point of dullness. Like, where we get to the whole idea of the whole family business angle and how they deal with that. And it's like, definitely feels more like it's like the soap opera portion. And it's like, if you're going to make this, sort of big, campy Tim Burton movie, I feel like you should probably be dealing with other things, as opposed to just this family's business. And the Carter scenes also feel like they should be something more than they are, when really they're pretty much just building up the whole she's trying to take his blood thing, and then the ultimate payoff in the very last scene, which doesn't mean anything, and nobody cares. But the thing here is that, I mean, some of those scenes do work. Like, I do like the visual image of him biting her, and then he, like, sucks all the blood, like, out of the bag that's attached to her, and stuff like that. But then, that pretty much goes right into, I failed to mention yet that Johnny Lee Miller's in this, and I think the reason is because I'm not really quite sure what Johnny Lee Miller's doing in this, because he is who is he? He's like Pfeiffer's brother or something. He's related somehow, and he's the one looking after David. But the thing is that he's sort of set up to be like this sort of schemer type. So there's like one scene, very similar to the Dan Hedaya character in The Addams Family, where he's watching him go down, and he's figuring out basically where he thinks the riches might be or whatever. But then when Depp figures this out, he basically puts him up against the wall and says, I could kill you right now, and, I could do anything because I'm a vampire and all that. But the trouble is that we've got a really big cast, and you haven't had very much screen time yet, so why don't you just get in a cab and leave, so we don't have to worry about spreading the screen time around anymore. Because the movie's been on for like almost an hour and a half at this point, and we need to get going, and you're just causing more plot threads, so be on your way, Johnny Lee Miller. And that's pretty much what that feels like, that whole thread. So that's sort of a big waste of time, unfortunately, and a waste of Johnny Lee Miller, which is also a crime. So, and also the Bella Heathcote character, where she's like his old love incarnate. But the problem is that when I watch this, I keep forgetting she's in it because she's just so not that important for long stretches, and we're just not even paying hardly the foggiest bit of attention to her. And then for her to kind of come back and sort of be, that whole big thing that makes it all come full circle just seems like really, really rushed, and just like just very sudden, especially when we get like the whole backstory of her like really late in the movie. It's like it really feels like this could have been stretched out and her character could have been more present, but the movie's just not doing that. For this really important character, weird enough. Maybe because at the time Bella Hadfield wasn't near the name that these other people are. I mean, she's probably still not, but I'm pretty sure people still know who she is to an extent. More so than they did in 2012. So, there is that. And every now and then they try to bring this life to this dullness with these big scenes like the sex scene with Eva Green, or the really nice scene that just sort of seems like its own thing when he goes back out into the woods and he kills the hippies. That's another thing where it's like, it's a surprisingly dark place that the character goes to kill these innocent people, and it like actually makes him depressed and all that, and it feels like this should be almost what the whole movie is. Forget the fucking family business thing. Quite honestly, deal with the Eva Green thing a bit more quickly. I know she's the one that changed him and killed his love and killed his parents and all that, but I mean, there's more interesting things here, believe it or not. And, god damn it. So finally, before I choke and die, the climax. The climax is kind of the, once again, I really wish there was another term, the final nail in the coffin, because the climax is pretty big and the climax is pretty dumb. Like, really, really dumb. The climax is so dumb, it's kind of like, imagine the entire movie of Death Becomes Her if that movie was trying to play it straight. And that's pretty much what the climax of Dark Shadows is. This is where I was talking about where Eva Green's performance gets a little bit too into the... It just kind of gets worse and worse as it goes, as she tries to do the more, big malicious witch thing, and it just really stops working. Then there's the whole Chloe Moretz as a werewolf thing, which is kind of hilarious for all the wrong reasons, because after this big reveal, and she has a couple of, lines here and there to say, oh, I'm the rebellious teenager, but hey, I'm also a werewolf. And then she gets thrown around a couple of times and proves how useless she is, and it really has no bearing on anything whatsoever that she's a werewolf. So we get rid of that. And then finally, just from out of fucking nowhere, the kid's mom's ghost thing comes in. And it's just a huge-ass clusterfuck, and like they just kind of tried to bring everything together, put all this stuff in here at the last minute to make it the biggest climax possible, and it just gets bigger and dumber the more that happens in it, and not really in the good or charming way, so that's really unfortunate. And that's pretty much where we leave the movie, too, on top of that, dumbass payoff to the Elena Bonham Carter thing, which, once again, really goes nowhere. And the whole, oh, he's reunited with his love thing, but, oh yeah, it's a character I kept forgetting was in the movie. So, yeah, there is some good stuff in here, and there are some cases where you see something and you're like, if the movie had just gone with this, it really could have been something, but it doesn't, so we're stuck with this. And it seems a lot more of the stuff we really don't need than the stuff that we would have liked to have seen more of. And it almost feels like with stuff like the lava lamp joke, or going into a story as dull as the family business thing, it's almost like it's actively trying to be less interesting than it can be, which is just baffling. So, once again, this is the kind of movie, this is the movie that we're stuck with. At the end of the day, it does feel more like a Burton knockoff than an actual Burton movie, despite the cast and everything, but they can only take it so far, so... Yeah, and that's not to say, obviously, Depp does have his great big comedic moments, like the reveal yourself tiny songstress scene will never not be funny, stuff like that, but, yeah, or like I said, the scoring his own despair on the synthesizer, but like I said, there's just really not enough of that is the main problem, so, obviously, if I had to choose between these two, like I said, I don't really love the Addams Family the way I did as a kid, but there's definitely a lot more to love here than in something like Dark Shadows, particularly from the angle of how they approach the humor, and like I said, the performances are all standout. The production design is crazy good. The stuff that Burton used to do really well, have sets like this, and sort of have like that, like I said, that Beetlejuice feel that he had in '88. just really is absent from this. So that's pretty much where I stand on those. So the next one, which with the way the scheduling is probably going to be like right after this, where we're going to go into Japanese horror. So we're just going to go right into that. So until that, that's